Great events make me quiet and calm. It is only trifles that irritate my nerves. Kind of makes you think, right? That's Queen Victoria, and I think it really gives you a glimpse into her personality. We're going deep on her life and times today, our guide, the documentary Queen Victoria, Empress of an Era.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
I think the way it brings together all these different voices, experts, her own letters, historical analysis, give you a really well-rounded picture of her, more than you usually get.
I agree. Okay, so Victoria's early life, born royal, obviously, but the documentary makes a point of how young she was when her dad died. And then she's raised under like super strict conditions by her mother and her advisor. That kind of pressure growing up, knowing you're going to be queen.
It's hard to even imagine, honestly, and you have to wonder how that all affected her later on, like her leadership style. The documentary actually talks about how she was really distrustful of certain politicians and advisors, probably because of all those early power struggles she saw in her own family.
Right. Like the seeds of it all were planted right there in her childhood. And then at 18, boom, she's queen. Talk about responsibility.
I know, it's crazy when you think about it,
Yeah.
especially the time period. Britain was changing so much then. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, tons of social reforms, the empire was growing like crazy.
Mhm.
To be at the center of all that must have been overwhelming.
Totally. And speaking of the empire, we can't forget this is peak British Empire time. Victoria's reign, Britain's global influence, was at its absolute highest point. Like, she ruled over 1/4 of the world's population. Think about the weight of that.
It's a lot. I
Mm.
mean, every decision she made had consequences, all across the globe. And don't forget about what was happening within Britain itself. The documentary keeps saying transformative era,
Mm.
and they're not exaggerating. Industry, science, culture, huge leaps forward, and she's at the head of it all.
Okay, to get a real sense of that transformative era, let's break it down. The documentary shows all this footage, these massive factories, all the new train lines, tons of inventions. It must have felt like the world was changing right before their eyes.
Yeah, it was really an unprecedented time for technology. I mean, think
Mhm.
about the railroads. During Victoria's reign, they went from like a couple hundred miles of track to over 20,000 miles.
Mm.
It totally changed transportation, boosted the economy, even the way society was structured.
And science too, right? Weren't there huge discoveries happening then?
Oh, absolutely. Darwin, I mean, he publishes On the Origin of Species during Victoria's reign, changes how we understand the entire natural world. And then you have medicine anesthesia being developed, revolutionizing surgery. The impact of these scientific discoveries is almost impossible to overstate.
The Victorian era, like the birthplace of so much innovation. And then there's the culture. The documentary mentions Dickens, the Bronte sisters, names we still know today. I feel like their writing really got at what people were feeling at the time.
Right. Oh, for sure. They captured it all. The gap between rich and poor, the strict social rules, but also this desire for things to get better, for reform. Reading those books is like a window into people's minds back then.
It's mind-blowing how much change was happening during her time as queen. But the documentary doesn't sugarcoat things, does it? Assassination attempts on Victoria, the Irish potato famine, and, of course, Prince Albert's death.
Right. It's important to acknowledge that. Those things affected both Victoria personally and, the whole nation. The documentary makes a good argument that those challenges, especially losing Albert, had a huge impact on her leadership and how she's remembered.
That's a really good point. So how does facing tragedies like that shape a leader, especially someone like Victoria with the weight of the whole empire on her shoulders? What stands out to you most about how she led through those tough times?
Well, it's easy to think of monarchs as being kind of distant figures, but this documentary really shows Victoria as a human being. You see her vulnerability, how much she was hurting, but she didn't let that stop her from doing her job. Instead, it's like she poured all that grief into her work, into caring for her people.
So she actually connected with her people more deeply because of what she'd been through.
Yeah, I think so. The documentary suggests that because she'd experienced such personal loss, she could really understand what the nation was going through during hard times. They saw her pain, her resilience, and her commitment, and it resonated with them.
It's amazing, huh? How even with all that grief, she never forgot what she had to do as queen. And thinking about her responsibilities, the documentary makes a big deal about how she was more than just a ruler. She became like a symbol for what being Victorian even meant.
Yeah, that's a key thing to understand about monarchies, I think. The monarch isn't just a politician. They're a symbol of the country itself. And Victoria, with all her emphasis on duty and family and never giving up, She kind of embodied what people thought of as good Victorian values.
But how does that even happen? Like, how do the queen's own values become a blueprint for the whole society? It's not like she wrote it down in a law or something.
Right, it's way more subtle. Think about, like, the media back then. Newspapers, drawings, even the early photographs, they all showed Victoria as this ideal Victorian woman. So her image was everywhere, and it just kept reinforcing all these ideas about family and being proper and stuff.
So she was almost like a living advertisement for Victorian values.
Kind of, yeah. And it wasn't just the image. Her actions mattered too. I mean, 9 kids, and she was very involved in raising them. So it's presenting this image of family life that really fit with how much Victorians valued the home and family ties.
It's wild how the queen's personal life, like having kids, could affect the whole country. And talking about personal stuff having public consequences, the documentary said when Albert died and Victoria withdrew from public life, it actually made people dislike the monarchy more.
It's true. It was a huge turning point. People were used to seeing their monarch out and about, and when she disappeared, it felt like a betrayal almost. The monarchy seemed distant, out of touch.
Her grief had actual political effects. Crazy.
Yeah. And it forced the royal family to completely change how they interacted with the public. They couldn't just do things the old-fashioned way anymore. They had to connect with people in a more real, personal way.
Is that where the whole idea of a people's monarchy comes from then?
For sure. I mean, look at how royals do things today with social media, charities, going out and meeting people. That whole idea of being accessible and transparent, you can trace it right back to Victoria and what happened after Albert died.
That's amazing to think about. So we've seen Victoria as this young queen, dealt with some really tough stuff, and then became this, like, icon of her era. But to really get her, we need to understand what the Victorian era was all about, right?
Right. And this is where things get interesting. Because the Victorian era was this weird mix of, like, super strict rules about how to behave and massive progress at the same time. It's confusing.
Yeah. They were so serious about morals and duty and all that, but also there's all this invention and scientific stuff, and the empire's expanding like crazy. It doesn't really make sense.
It is kind of contradictory, but that's history for you.
Yeah.
Times like the Victorian era are messy. They're not just one thing or the other. It was both super uptight and super progressive, you know?
Okay, but how do those two things even work together?
Well, imagine it's like all this new technology and industry stuff comes along, and it's making people nervous. Their world is changing too fast. So they cling to the old ways, to morals and rules, because it makes them feel safe.
So the progress itself made them want to be more strict.
Yeah, it's like a way to cope with all the crazy changes happening. And remember, most people back then, they didn't think those rules were bad. It gave them a sense of order in a world that was changing really fast.
It's like trying to hold on to something solid while everything's shaking around you.
Exactly. That's the Victorian era in a nutshell. Progress and anxiety, freedom, and being trapped. It was complicated.
And Victoria herself seems like she was a lot like that too. The documentary even says that Victoria and the Victorian era are like basically the same thing. What parts of her personality do you think are most like that whole time period?
It's true. She really does sum up her era. Her sense of duty, for sure. She was serious about being queen. It was like her most important job, that hard work, responsibility stuff. Very Victorian.
And even after Albert died, she didn't quit.
Exactly. She was resilient. And that's another big Victorian idea.
Yeah.
Facing problems head on, never giving up. She kind of embodied that for the whole country.
Like she was proof they could survive anything.
Yeah. And then there's the whole family thing, which obviously was huge for Victorians. Her being a mom, being all about domestic life, that really resonated with people.
So we've got Victoria as a queen, a symbol, but the documentary also shows her as like just a woman living in a world run by men. We hear from historians and her descendants and people who study culture, and they all talk about how she actually had a lot of power despite all that.
That's what I find so interesting about her. Here she is, this woman in charge during a time when women weren't supposed to be in charge. But she figured out how to make things happen.
What were some of the ways she did that, especially when it came to the empire?
Well, the documentary talks about how she was really good at soft power. You know, she understood how important it was to look and act a certain way, how to use that to get people to support her ideas. Like, she was really into social reform, things like better schools and healthcare. So she used her position to get people talking about those things, to push the government to make changes.
It wasn't just about ordering people around. It was about using her influence to create change.
Exactly. And she wasn't afraid to, like, work behind the scenes, too. They show all these letters she wrote to prime ministers and important people. She was definitely involved in how the government was run. She knew how to play the game and get what she wanted.
So not just this sad queen in mourning. She was smart, she was tough, she got things done. That changes how you think about her.
For sure, and that's why studying her is so fascinating. There's always something new to learn about her. The documentary does a great job of showing all the different sides of her.
It really does. Okay, so we've talked about Victoria's whole life, the good and the bad, what she achieved, what she left behind. We've seen her as all these different things. A queen, a symbol, a wife, a mother, just a person trying to make sense of the world, really. But before we wrap up, I got to bring up something you said earlier. You said Victoria and the Victorian era are inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. And there's this quote from the documentary that just makes you think. Victoria said, "I think people really marry far too much. It is such a lottery after all, and for a poor woman, a very doubtful happiness." What do you think she meant by that, after everything we've talked about?
Wow, that's a good one to think about. Shows what she really thought about marriage, which had to be a huge deal for her, especially with how much she loved Albert and then losing him. And it kind of shows how much pressure there was back then for people to get married, especially women.
It makes you wonder how much of that pressure she felt, even as queen. I mean, everyone's looking at her, judging her, and then she says something like that about marriage.
It reminds you that even queens are people, right? They have their own feelings and experiences, and sometimes those experiences make them question the way things are supposed to be.
Wow. Lots to think about there. We've only just started to uncover who Queen Victoria really was, haven't we?
Definitely just scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But hopefully this has made you want to learn more. There's a ton of stuff out there, the Royal Archives, museums, biographies, and of course, those letters we talked about.
Yeah, you never know what you'll find when you start digging into history. Okay, so we've covered Victoria's childhood, becoming queen, all the good and bad that came with that, and what she means to the world today.
It's been quite a journey. And I think the biggest takeaway is how much her own life, the ups and downs, are tied to what was happening in the world around her. She was a product of her time, but she also changed her time.
Perfectly said. And to everyone listening, if you're feeling inspired, remember, we've barely scratched the surface. There's a whole world of information out there about Queen Victoria and her era just waiting to be explored. So keep diving in. It just hit me talking about Victoria and everything. Her whole story is kind of like the story of how the British monarchy itself changed.
Oh, that's interesting. Like we're seeing the monarchy evolve right alongside her.
Yeah. At the beginning, it was all super traditional, right? The royals were way over here and everyone else was over there.
Totally. And then when Victoria kind of disappeared after Albert died, that distance backfired on them. It was like, oh, we can't be so disconnected anymore. We got to connect with people or they'll turn on us.
Huge turning point.
Yeah.
What do you think would happen if Albert hadn't died? Would they have changed anyway?
Who knows? But I think losing him and then her coming back to public life, it forced the monarchy to rethink everything. They had to become more relatable, more in touch with what people were going through. And that's still how it works today, right? Royals are out there on social media, doing charity stuff, meeting people.
So Victoria's personal life, even the really sad parts, ended up shaping the monarchy for like centuries after her. It's crazy how one person can have that much impact.
It's true. It shows you that even these big institutions, with all their history and rules, they can change. Sometimes it takes the right person or the right situation to push them in a new direction.
It's like history isn't just dates and battles. It's about the people who lived through it all, and their experiences still matter to us today.
Absolutely. And I think we've done a pretty good job of bringing Victoria to life today. All the stuff we talked about, her childhood, becoming queen, what she went through, what she left behind.
She was so many things at once. A queen, a symbol, a wife, a mother, and at the end of the day, just a person like all of us. But she definitely changed the world.
She did. And I hope we've made you want to learn more about her. We've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to her story.
Totally agree. So to everyone listening, if you're feeling curious, there's no shortage of info out there. The Royal Archives, museums, biographies, you name it. Go explore. You won't regret it.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep on diving.